Pedro woke up before dawn, just as he did every day, in the tiny room he shared with his father, Antonio. The early morning chill seeped through the thin walls, which were covered with old, peeling wallpaper. Beneath it, patches of exposed plaster hinted at the years of wear and tear. Pedro's blanket, worn and too thin to stave off the cold, provided little comfort against the biting air. As he quietly slipped out of bed, he was careful not to make a sound, not wanting to disturb his father's fragile sleep. Antonio had been unwell for months, his body weakened, and the shallow rise and fall of his chest carried a weight that hung heavily on Pedro's young shoulders. Antonio's illness had changed everything. What should have been a childhood filled with play had become a struggle for Pedro, forcing him to mature far beyond his years. He was just a boy, yet he shouldered responsibilities as though he were a grown man. Pedro moved quickly, pulling on his worn-out t-shirt and slipping his feet into sneakers that were already too small, their fabric stretched and frayed around his toes. In a small cloth bag, he carefully packed the fruits he planned to sell that day at the market, checking each one with the precision and attention of someone who knew his earnings could mean the difference between his father's comfort and discomfort. In the dim light of the room, he glanced over at his father, lying thin and pale against the pillow. Antonio's face, once robust and lined with a hard-working man's strength, now looked haggard, his brow furrowed even in sleep, as though the weight of his illness pressed upon him even in dreams. Pedro knew that the few coins he earned each day barely covered the cost of Antonio's medication, but it was all they had. Each day he would rise, fill his bag, and make the lonely trek to the marketplace, hoping to scrape together enough to sustain them a little longer. And so, today was no different. Pedro stepped outside quietly, pulling the door shut behind him as he left their small home. Outside, a fine mist had settled over the streets, giving everything a ghostly, melancholic stillness. The faint orange glow on the horizon signaled that sunrise was not far off, but the world around him remained wrapped in shadow, as though the light was struggling to break through the grayness. He walked through the deserted streets, his footsteps echoing softly on the damp ground as he hugged his bag to his chest. These walks were often filled with a swirl of thoughts and worries that seemed to grow heavier with each step. He wondered, as he did each morning, when his father might recover, if he ever would, and whether he would ever get to experience the freedom of childhood, like the other kids he occasionally saw running and laughing on their way to school. When Pedro reached the main road leading toward the market, the city was slowly coming to life. He passed by the edges of neighborhoods more affluent than his own, noticing houses with lights flickering on, and occasionally he caught a glimpse of a family seated together at breakfast. A pang of longing rose within him, but he pushed it aside, focusing instead on the task ahead. The fruits he carried were his lifeline, each piece carefully picked and arranged so they looked their best. He knew well that appearances mattered in his line of work. As he approached the market, the once still world began to hum with activity. The feirantes, or street vendors, bustled around, setting up their stalls and calling out greetings to each other, their voices warm and lively. Pedro felt a fleeting sense of belonging here, a brief reprieve from his struggles as he joined the familiar rhythm of the marketplace. Here, he wasn't just a boy with burdens. He was part of something larger, part of a community where everyone was hustling to make a living. This small solace meant more to him than he would admit, and he clung to it, using it as fuel to keep going day after day. He found his usual spot and began arranging his fruits, selecting the freshest and most vibrant ones to display at the front. He had learned the art of salesmanship quickly, his genuine smile, the attentive way he addressed customers, and his unfailing politeness had earned him a reputation. People were drawn to him, sensing a goodness and resilience that made them want to support him, even if they didn't always buy. "Bom dia, Pedro. Up so early as usual?" called out Donna Marlene, a friendly woman with silver-streaked hair who sold vegetables from the stall next to his. Pedro looked up and smiled, tucking a stray piece of hair behind his ear. "Bom dia, Donna Marlene." "Early, just like always," he replied with a hint of weariness, but his tone remained upbeat. "The fruit won't sell itself," he added with a grin, masking the exhaustion he felt. As he continued to set up, his gaze occasionally drifted toward the bustling crowd, watching people hurry by with purpose, each one carrying their own unspoken stories. Here, he found a small sanctuary where the shared struggles of the marketplace allowed him, if only briefly, to put aside his fears and just be another vendor among many. Pedro's hands worked swiftly, arranging the apples and oranges with care. He knew that this simple arrangement was a skill in itself, one he had perfected through countless mornings like this, adjusting and rearranging the fruits until each one shone with an appeal that he hoped would catch a buyer's eye. His fingers brushed over a particularly bright apple, and for a moment he imagined being able to afford more, maybe even enough to buy his father a proper blanket to keep out the cold. But just as quickly as the thought came, he let it go, returning to the task with the steady determination that had carried him this far. There were no illusions in Pedro's world. Dreams, though present, had to be carefully managed and tethered to reality. In this humble routine, Pedro found purpose, a way to stay connected to his father, his world, and his duty. The quiet strength he carried within him, unassuming yet unbreakable, was perhaps his greatest asset. It drove him forward, kept him resilient, and offered a kind of solace, even as he bore the weight of responsibilities far too heavy for a boy his age. At the market, the scene was vibrant and full of life. Despite the early hour, the square was bustling with activity. Vendors rushed to set up their stalls, calling out to each other and filling the air with greetings and laughter. The comforting scent of fresh produce and baked bread mingled with the morning air, creating a warm and lively atmosphere. Pedro loved this part of the day. Here, surrounded by the busy sounds of the market, he could momentarily forget his worries. For a few precious moments, he was just another kid trying to make an honest living. "Bom dia, Pedro. Up and about early as always," called out Donna Marlene, an older woman with silver hair and a kind smile who sold vegetables from the stall next to his. Pedro smiled back at her, pulling his attention away from his thoughts. "Bom dia, Donna Marlene, as usual. The fruits don't sell themselves," he replied, trying to hide the fatigue in his voice. Though he was often tired, Pedro took great pride in his little stall. He carefully arranged his fruits, placing the ripest and freshest at the front, knowing that a good display could make all the difference. His smile and warm greetings had earned him the trust of many customers. People would often stop by, even just to say hello, or give him an encouraging pat on the back. Pedro's sincerity and kindness radiated from him, drawing people in. "Those apples look beautiful today, Pedro." "I'll take a few for my grandkids," said Señor Geraldo, a frail older man who frequently bought from Pedro. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the fruits. Pedro took the apples from him with care and placed them in a bag, smiling. "Here you go, Señor Geraldo. I'll give you a special price," Pedro said, grateful to have a loyal customer. As the morning progressed, the market grew busier, with people bustling around, conversations blending into a soft hum in the background. Pedro focused intently on his sales, counting every coin, each sale a step closer to getting his father the medicine he needed. But amid the familiar sounds of the market, Pedro heard something unusual, a distant metallic sound that seemed to be growing louder. He looked up and saw a car speeding down the narrow street leading to the square. Its horn blared repeatedly, but it was clear the driver had lost control. Pedro stood on his toes, craning his neck to see past the crowd, and that's when he spotted her. A young girl around his age, standing in the middle of the street, completely unaware of the car hurtling toward her as she looked down at her phone. Time seemed to slow. Without thinking, Pedro dropped the fruits he was holding and bolted toward her, his legs moving faster than they ever had. Every step was fueled by instinct, the pounding of his heart in his ears like a drum. As he neared her, he stretched out his arm, grabbing her wrist and yanking her out of harm's way with all the strength he had. The car sped by, so close that the force of its passing whipped through Pedro's hair. Both he and the girl stumbled to the ground, safe but shaken. The girl sat up, her eyes wide with shock as she looked at Pedro, still trying to process what had just happened. Her breath came in short gasps, her face pale as she realized the danger she had narrowly escaped. You saved me," she murmured, her voice barely audible, as if she were speaking to herself rather than to Pedro. Pedro, too, was catching his breath, feeling the adrenaline surge through him. He had acted on pure impulse, not for thanks or recognition, but simply because it was the right thing to do. It was as if something within him had taken over, guiding his actions without hesitation. Before Pedro could respond to the girl's awed words, a man suddenly appeared, pushing through the crowd that had gathered around them. He was tall, dressed in a sharply tailored suit that stood out in the marketplace, and his salt and pepper hair was combed back neatly. His face was etched with fear and relief as he hurried over to them, falling to his knees beside the girl and pulling her into a tight embrace. It was clear from the way he held her that he was her father, and in that moment, the depth of his love and worry for her was unmistakable. "Clara, my God, Clara, are you okay?" he asked, his voice choked with emotion as he examined her face, his hands gently cupping her cheeks, as though he needed to assure himself that she was truly unharmed. "Did you get hurt? Are you all right?" His hands moved quickly, checking her arms, her shoulders, every part of her to make sure she was safe. The girl, Clara, shook her head slowly, still in shock, but managing a small, reassuring nod. "I'm fine, Dad. I didn't even see the car," Clara replied, her voice still trembling as she leaned into her father's embrace, finding comfort in his protective presence. If it hadn't been for him... She glanced over at Pedro, her eyes wide with gratitude and something else. A sense of awe for this boy who had risked his own safety for her. The man, still holding his daughter close, turned to Pedro, his expression shifting from relief to something deeper, gratitude mixed with an emotion Pedro couldn't quite place. It was as though, in those few seconds, the man had realized the magnitude of what Pedro had done. With one last squeeze, he released Clara and stood up, extending a hand to help Pedro up as well. Pedro took it hesitantly, and as he stood, the man looked him directly in the eyes, his gaze intense and unwavering. "Son, you saved my daughter's life," he said, his voice thick with gratitude and disbelief. "I don't know how to thank you. I owe you more than words could ever express." The man's hands moved to his pockets, and he pulled out a wallet, opening it swiftly and taking out a thick stack of bills. Without a second thought, he held the money out to Pedro, his hand trembling slightly with the weight of what he felt he owed this boy. Pedro looked down at the money, his chest tightening. The sheer amount of cash stunned him. It was more than he'd ever seen at one time, and he could already imagine how much it would mean for him and his father. He thought of all the medicine and food it could buy, the doctor's visits it might cover, yet despite the urgent need that flared up within him, something in him resisted. He hadn't saved Clara for a reward. His reasons for helping her had come from a place far deeper than money. Looking back up, Pedro met the man's gaze with a quiet steadiness, shaking his head slowly. I can't accept this, sir," Pedro said softly, his voice resolute despite the trembling he felt inside. "I didn't do it for money. I did it because it was the right thing to do." He stepped back slightly, a look of conviction in his eyes that went beyond his years, as though he understood, on an unspoken level, the true meaning of integrity. The man's hand froze in midair, the cash still extended toward Pedro as he stared at the boy, visibly taken aback. His mouth opened slightly, as though he wanted to insist, to tell Pedro to take the money because he'd earned it, because he deserved it. But there was something in Pedro's expression, something steady and grounded, that stopped him. Slowly the man lowered his hand, returning the money to his wallet with a sense of awe. He looked at Pedro, as though he were seeing something extraordinary, something rare that went beyond mere courage. "But there must be something I can do for you," the man said, his voice softer now, almost pleading, as if he needed to give back to Pedro in some way to reconcile the overwhelming gratitude he felt. "Please, let me help you somehow." Pedro hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. The vulnerability in his face became apparent, the weight of his reality surfacing now that the adrenaline of the moment had faded. Taking a deep breath, he glanced up at the man, his expression sincere yet hesitant. "There is something, actually," Pedro began, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not for me, though. It's for my father. He's sick, and the medicine he needs is really expensive. I sell fruit here every day to try to pay for it, but it's not enough." His words were simple, but they carried the burden of 1,000 unspoken hardships, a life shaped by resilience and sacrifice. Pedro's eyes, usually bright with determination, softened with worry as he spoke of his father's illness, revealing the depth of his love and devotion. The man, Eduardo, took in Pedro's words, his face tightening with emotion. He watched Pedro standing there, a young boy who had risked everything to save a stranger and yet asked for nothing in return but help for his father. In that moment, Eduardo saw something in Pedro that mirrored his own past, a strength, a selflessness that he had once known himself. Memories surfaced, long buried and softened by time, of a young boy he had once been, struggling to survive and protect his own family. That familiar ache, the sense of responsibility too big for his shoulders, stirred within him as he looked at Pedro. "Your father," Eduardo said slowly, his voice filled with a new tenderness. "What's his name?" "Antonio," Pedro replied, his voice barely audible. He felt vulnerable, exposed, but somehow safe in sharing this with the man who had seen his courage firsthand. Eduardo nodded thoughtfully, his mind already working, formulating a plan. He placed a steady hand on Pedro's shoulder, his grip both strong and gentle, a gesture filled with understanding and empathy. "You have a bravery in you that not many people have, Pedro. And I understand what you're going through more than you realize," he said, his voice softening as he looked deeply into the boy's eyes. "If you'll let me, I'll make sure your father gets the help he needs. I have resources that can do more for him than selling fruit ever could. It's the least I can do." Pedro's eyes widened, a flicker of hope mingling with disbelief as he looked up at Eduardo. You really mean that, sir?" His voice held a tentative tremor, a fragile hope that felt foreign, as though he were afraid to believe it too fully, lest it slip through his fingers. Eduardo nodded, his face resolute. "Yes, Pedro. I mean it. Not only will I ensure your father receives the best medical care, but I'll make sure you can go back to school. A boy your age shouldn't have to worry about these things." He paused, a small, compassionate smile breaking through his serious expression. "You deserve the chance to be a kid, Pedro." From behind Eduardo, Clara looked at Pedro with a newfound admiration, a soft smile on her lips. "It'll be good, Pedro," she said gently. "I go to a great school, and you could come with me. I could help you get used to it. You'll see, things can get better." Pedro looked from Clara to Eduardo, a whirlwind of emotions churning within him. He felt an overwhelming gratitude, but also a sense of disbelief. This felt like a lifeline he had never dared to dream of, a chance to lift the burden he had carried for so long. Yet part of him feared that this kindness was too good to be true, that it would vanish the moment he let himself believe in it. Finally, Pedro took a deep breath, his voice wavering with emotion. "I don't know what to say. If you really can help my father, then yes, I accept. I just want to see him get better." Eduardo's face softened, relief washing over him. "Then it's settled. Let's make this happen, Pedro. I'll make some calls right now, and we'll get everything in motion." Pulling out his phone, Eduardo stepped aside to arrange for immediate medical help, his voice steady and focused as he spoke with a network of doctors and staff. For Pedro, watching Eduardo take control of the situation was like witnessing a miracle. Just minutes ago, he had been a boy standing alone in the marketplace, and now, here was someone willing to stand by him, to share his struggle. Clara moved closer to Pedro, her eyes warm and encouraging. "You did something amazing today," she whispered, her voice filled with admiration. "You saved my life, and now your father will have a chance to be saved too. It's like destiny, don't you think?" Pedro looked at her, still trying to absorb the enormity of everything that had happened. A spark of hope ignited within him, a light that had been dimmed by hardship, but now flickered brightly. "I just did what anyone would do," he said, his tone humble, as if reluctant to see himself as a hero. But Clara's soft laugh and gentle smile told him that in her eyes he was more than he realized. As Eduardo finished his calls, he returned to Pedro with a look of quiet determination. "I've arranged everything, Pedro. A medical team will be at your home within the hour. This is just the beginning. Things are going to change for you and your father. You don't have to face this alone anymore." Pedro stared at Eduardo, a mixture of gratitude, awe, and relief flooding his heart. In one breathtaking turn of events, his life had shifted from a relentless struggle to a promise of healing and support. For the first time in a long while, he felt that he could dare to hope. As he looked around at Clara, at Eduardo, and then up toward the sky where the sun had finally broken through the clouds, Pedro felt a warmth deep within, a quiet certainty that maybe, just maybe, things would be all right. Eduardo, still reeling from the courage Pedro had shown, felt an overwhelming sense of purpose settle within him. He watched the boy standing there, holding on to a quiet strength that was rare, even in adults. Pedro's humility, his simple yet profound desire for nothing but his father's well-being, had stirred something deep within Eduardo. The weight of responsibility he felt was not just gratitude, it was a calling, a reminder of his own journey, and an urge to do right by this boy who had given so much with so little. Eduardo took a steadying breath, composing himself. This was more than just an act of thanks. He wanted to make a real, lasting difference. He moved closer to Pedro, looking at him with a resolve that conveyed a promise of commitment. "Pedro," Eduardo began, his tone gentle but firm, "today you've shown me something priceless. You saved my daughter, my most precious treasure. There are no words that can match what you've done, and no amount of money could ever repay you. But I don't want this to be just about repayment. I want to help you and your father in a way that will make a lasting difference." Pedro looked up at Eduardo, his eyes wide with cautious hope, still trying to comprehend the depth of this man's generosity. Eduardo's words, spoken with such sincerity, resonated within him, yet he couldn't shake the fear that this was all too good to be true. He was used to life's struggles, to making do with little, and the idea of someone stepping in to change that seemed almost unreal. "Sir, I don't know what to say. This is more than I could have ever dreamed of. Pedro admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. He glanced down, feeling the weight of gratitude, but also the vulnerability that came with accepting help from a stranger. He had spent so long fending for himself, shouldering burdens beyond his years, that the offer of relief felt both exhilarating and frightening. Eduardo sensed the boy's hesitation and placed a comforting hand on Pedro's shoulder. "You don't have to say anything, Pedro. Just let me help. Your bravery, your love for your father, it's something that deserves recognition, and it's something that has moved me in a way I can't quite explain." He paused, as if choosing his next words carefully. "I know what it feels like to be in your position. I came from humble beginnings too. My family struggled, much like you and your father, and I understand the weight of worry that you carry. That's why I want to make sure you don't have to bear this alone anymore." Eduardo's voice softened, a tinge of emotion seeping through as he recalled memories of his own past. He hadn't always been a successful businessman. He had worked his way up from nothing, enduring hardships that had taught him resilience and humility. Now, looking at Pedro, he saw a mirror of his younger self, a young boy who would do anything to protect the ones he loved, even at the cost of his own dreams and childhood. As Eduardo spoke, Clara stood beside him, her expression tender and empathetic. She understood her father's decision, the pull of compassion that had driven him to offer Pedro so much. She felt a sense of pride, not just for what Pedro had done for her, but for the way her father was responding. It was clear to her that this wasn't just about gratitude. It was about honoring Pedro's integrity, his selflessness, and offering him a path that he might never have had otherwise. "Pedro," Eduardo continued, his gaze steady, "I've already arranged for the best doctors to see your father. They'll assess his condition, and I'll cover all medical costs. But I want to do more than that. I want to make sure you're taken care of too. You're still so young, and you deserve to focus on your studies, to grow and to dream without having to worry about your father's health or how you'll afford your next meal." Eduardo's offer felt like a lifeline that extended far beyond what Pedro had expected. He felt a swell of gratitude, a warmth that spread through him, filling the spaces where fear and anxiety had once lived. But a lingering uncertainty gnawed at him. "But, sir, what if my father doesn't get better? What if I can't repay you?" His voice was tinged with worry, the weight of his circumstances making it hard for him to fully embrace this new hope. Eduardo's face softened, and he gave Pedro a reassuring smile. "Pedro, you don't need to repay me. This isn't a debt, it's a gift. Sometimes life gives us opportunities to help others, and today you've given me that chance. I'm doing this because I believe in you, because I see something extraordinary in you." He paused, his hand resting on Pedro's shoulder with a steady, reassuring presence. "I know you'll pay it forward one day in your own way. That's all I would ever ask." The relief in Pedro's expression was unmistakable, as though a weight he had carried for so long had finally lifted. Eduardo's words, his sincerity, offered Pedro something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of safety, a belief that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. It was as if Eduardo's generosity was wrapping around him, providing a shield against the hardships that had defined his life until now. Clara, who had been listening quietly, stepped forward with a warm smile. "Pedro, this isn't just about helping you now. This is about making sure you can live your life the way you deserve to. Imagine going back to school, learning, growing. You're strong, Pedro. You've been carrying so much on your own, but now you don't have to do it alone." Her words struck a chord deep within him. He had spent so many nights lying awake, his mind churning with worries about his father's health, about whether he would have enough to get through the next day. The idea of focusing on something as simple as school, of being able to look toward a future that didn't involve struggle and sacrifice at every turn, seemed like a dream he had never dared to hope for. Eduardo, sensing that Pedro needed a moment to process, gave him a small nod and took out his phone once again. "I'll call the hospital now and make sure they send a team over to your home right away," he said, his voice calm and resolute. He walked a few steps away, speaking in low tones as he arranged for an urgent assessment and treatment for Antonio. Pedro watched Eduardo, a mix of awe and gratitude evident on his face. His mind raced with possibilities, his heart swelling with a cautious optimism that had once felt out of reach. Clara gave him a reassuring smile, her own eyes shining with pride. "See, Pedro, you don't have to be afraid. My father will take care of everything, and you deserve it, more than anyone I know." A few minutes later, Eduardo returned, his face set with quiet determination. "The team will be at your house within the hour. They're some of the best doctors, and they'll make sure your father receives the care he needs." Eduardo's gaze softened as he continued, "This is just the beginning, Pedro. We're going to ensure that you and your father get the support you both deserve, and when he's better, you'll have a future to look forward to, a future where you can be the incredible young man you're meant to be." Pedro's heart thumped in his chest, the hope within him now blooming into something real, something tangible. The kindness and generosity he had been shown today had touched him in a way he would never forget. He knew, without a doubt, that this moment would change his life forever. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, he felt a newfound strength, a resilience that Eduardo's generosity had kindled in him. Clara looked at Pedro with a warm, encouraging smile, one that hinted at the possibilities awaiting him. "Things are going to be okay, Pedro. You've given so much to others, and now it's time for you to receive a little kindness in return. You don't have to worry anymore." Pedro looked at Eduardo, at Clara, at the bustling market that had been his only refuge, and felt a wave of gratitude so powerful that it left him speechless. He nodded, his eyes filled with tears he fought to keep from falling, and in that silence he made a promise to himself to honor the generosity he had been given, to live up to the faith that Eduardo had placed in him, and to someday, somehow, pay it forward to someone else who needed it just as much as he had today. As the news of what Pedro had done spread through the market, a quiet ripple of admiration began to shift the atmosphere around him. People who had known Pedro as the hard-working, soft-spoken boy selling fruit now looked at him with newfound respect. Some whispered about his bravery, while others pointed him out to their friends with a nod of approval. The word traveled quickly from one stall to another until the entire marketplace knew how he had risked his own life to save a stranger. There was a sense that something extraordinary had happened among them. An act of courage and kindness that felt like a rare, precious gift in the everyday hum of their lives. In the midst of this quiet stir, Eduardo stood beside Pedro, still marveling at the boy's quiet humility. The more Eduardo learned about Pedro, the more he felt compelled to honor the young man's actions in a way that went beyond mere words. It wasn't just about providing the medical care Pedro's father needed. It was about making sure Pedro himself received the recognition he deserved. Eduardo realized that Pedro's story was a reminder of something essential, something powerful, that even those with the least to give often possess the most to offer. Seeing the way people reacted to Pedro's story, Eduardo felt a deep sense of purpose stirring within him. He had spent years working his way to the top, building his business and growing his wealth, but something about Pedro's courage had shaken him, reminding him of values he hadn't felt so acutely in a long time. He understood that the impact of Pedro's actions extended far beyond a single life saved. It was a story that could inspire others to act with kindness, to look beyond themselves, to remember that compassion and empathy were qualities as valuable as any fortune. Turning to Pedro, Eduardo placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, his gaze filled with warmth and admiration. "Pedro," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion, "you may not realize this, but what you did today is more powerful than you know. It's more than just an act of bravery. It's a reminder to everyone here, to everyone who hears your story, of the difference one person can make. People need stories like yours. They need to know that kindness and selflessness still exist in this world, and I want to make sure your story is shared. Pedro looked up at Eduardo, surprise flickering across his face. "Shared?" he asked, his voice hesitant. He hadn't done anything for the sake of recognition or admiration. In fact, the idea of his actions being known by others felt strange, almost overwhelming. But Eduardo's sincerity reassured him. There was no trace of exploitation in Eduardo's words, only a genuine belief that Pedro's courage deserved to be seen, that it could inspire others. "Yes, shared," Eduardo said with a nod. "Think of the people who might be reminded of their own courage, or who might feel inspired to help others just by hearing about what you did. Sometimes, an act of kindness can spread like a wave, reaching far beyond the people directly involved. You've given us all a gift today, Pedro, whether you realize it or not." Pedro's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and humility. He thought of his father, how he had always raised Pedro to be kind, to think of others, to hold on to goodness even in the face of hardship. His father had often spoken of the importance of doing what was right, not for recognition but because it was the essence of being human. And here he was, his father's teachings woven into his every decision, now seen and appreciated by people who didn't even know him. Around them, the crowd continued to grow, drawn by the unfolding scene and the whispers of Pedro's actions. Some approached him directly, offering words of gratitude and admiration. "I heard what you did, Pedro," said one vendor, a middle-aged man who sold handmade baskets. "That took courage. Not everyone would have done what you did, and we're all proud to know you." Another woman, her face etched with years of hard work, smiled warmly at Pedro. "You've given us something to believe in today, Pedro," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. "Sometimes we get so caught up in our own struggles that we forget there are people out there willing to risk everything for someone else." Each word of praise, each grateful nod and handshake seemed to breathe life into Pedro, filling him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before. His actions had always been motivated by love and duty, love for his father, duty to his family's well-being. But now, for the first time, he saw his role in a broader context. He was not just a boy struggling to get by, he was part of a community, a collective spirit of resilience and compassion that held them all together. As the day unfolded, Eduardo made calls to his contacts, including local media outlets, hoping to find ways to share Pedro's story in a way that honored his bravery and highlighted the message of selflessness. He explained Pedro's story with reverence, emphasizing how this young boy from humble beginnings had acted with a heroism that was beyond expectation. Reporters arrived, intrigued by the story, their cameras capturing the humble hero as Pedro stood, slightly embarrassed, among the crowd that had gathered around him. Pedro had never been the center of attention like this, and though he felt out of place, he also understood that his story could help others, perhaps inspire them to believe in the goodness that sometimes felt hard to find. As Eduardo spoke to the reporters, he was careful to focus on the impact of Pedro's actions. "Pedro here saved my daughter's life without a second thought," he said, his voice rich with pride. He risked himself not for reward or recognition, but because he believed it was the right thing to do. I think his story is one that reminds us all of our shared humanity, of the fact that we are all connected in ways we sometimes forget. One of the reporters, moved by the story, approached Pedro directly, her microphone extended toward him as she asked gently, "Pedro, what motivated you to act so quickly, to put yourself at risk to save someone you didn't even know?" Pedro hesitated, glancing at Eduardo and then at the crowd around him. He felt a surge of shyness, not quite comfortable in the spotlight, but he took a deep breath and answered, honestly. "I didn't really think about it," he said, his voice steady but soft. "I saw her there and I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just stand by and watch. My father always taught me that doing the right thing doesn't need a reason. It's just what we should do, and that's all I tried to do." The crowd fell silent, hanging onto his every word, and Pedro's simple explanation seemed to touch them more deeply than any grand speech could have. His words were a testament to the purity of his intentions, to a strength of character that had been shaped by hardship but was softened by love and kindness. In that moment, Pedro became a symbol of hope, a reminder that courage and compassion often come from the most unexpected places. As the crowd began to disperse, people returned to their stalls and shops with a renewed sense of purpose. Pedro's story, his bravery, would stay with them, weaving its way into the fabric of the marketplace, becoming a tale they would tell for years to come. The story of the young boy who risked everything without a second thought, who showed them all that even the smallest acts could hold immense power, that a single moment of courage could ripple through the lives of many. In the days that followed, Pedro noticed subtle changes in the market. Vendors who had once been preoccupied with their own struggles seemed more willing to help each other, sharing goods, lending a hand, or simply offering a kind word. Customers too seemed warmer, more appreciative of the simple acts of kindness around them. It was as though Pedro's story had awakened a sense of unity, a reminder of their shared humanity, inspiring them to look beyond their own worries and remember the strength they found in one another. Eduardo watched these changes unfold with quiet satisfaction, knowing that his decision to share Pedro's story had been the right one. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about planting a seed of hope, about showing people that in a world often filled with hardship, there were still those who would give without expecting anything in return. And Pedro, with his humble heroism, had given them all something to believe in. And as Pedro continued to work at his stall, returning each day with the same quiet dedication, he felt a shift within himself. His life had changed in ways he could hardly have imagined, and though he remained grounded, his heart carried a renewed purpose. He was no longer just a boy selling fruit to support his father. He was part of a larger story, a symbol of resilience and kindness in his community. And as he looked around at the familiar faces in the marketplace, he knew that no matter what came next, he would carry this experience with him, a beacon of hope that would guide him forward. As the days passed, Pedro's life began to shift in subtle but profound ways. The changes were small at first, gestures of kindness from neighbors, smiles from strangers who now recognized him as the boy who had saved a life. He found himself adjusting to a strange new reality, where people looked at him with admiration, but beneath this recognition, Pedro remained humble, carrying himself with the same quiet strength that had guided him all his life. Pedro's story had struck a chord in the community, touching people's hearts in ways he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about his bravery, it was about the values he embodied. Kindness, humility, and the relentless drive to protect those he loved. People saw in him a reflection of the universal struggles they all faced, the desire to do right, to protect family, to hold on to hope even when life seemed unbearably hard. Pedro's story was one of resilience, of finding light in dark times, and it resonated deeply with everyone who heard it. As the days turned into weeks, Eduardo continued to honor the promise he had made to Pedro. True to his word, he ensured that Pedro's father, Antonio, received the best possible care. Doctors came to their home, assessing Antonio's condition with a level of thoroughness and respect that Pedro had never seen before. Eduardo's influence brought not just medical expertise, but a sense of dignity that reminded Antonio he was not just a patient, but a person worthy of care and compassion. Pedro watched these changes with a mixture of relief and disbelief. He had spent so long struggling to keep his father safe, fighting against the limitations of poverty, that the sudden shift felt almost like a dream. For the first time in years, Pedro could see a future for himself, one that went beyond simply surviving each day. He began to imagine a life where he could go to school, learn and grow without the constant weight of worry pressing down on him. But even as hope blossomed within him, Pedro felt a quiet humility grounding him. His father, though improving, was still fragile, and Pedro knew that the journey to recovery would take time. At night, after a day spent at the market and tending to his father, he would sit beside Antonio's bed, sharing stories of his day, of the people he met, of the small acts of kindness he saw around him. These moments were filled with quiet laughter, a warmth that filled their small home with a sense of peace. One evening, as Pedro recounted the latest news from the market, Antonio listened with a quiet smile, his face lined with both weariness and pride. "You've grown so much, Pedro," he murmured, his voice soft but filled with emotion. "I'm proud of the man you're becoming. You've faced so many challenges, but you never lost your kindness, your compassion. That's worth more than anything in this world." Pedro's eyes stung with unshed tears as he listened to his father's words. There was a weight to them, a depth that came from years of shared struggle, of silent sacrifices and unspoken love. His father had been his guide, his compass, teaching him that true strength lay not in wealth or status, but in the ability to hold on to goodness even when life was difficult. It was this lesson that had shaped Pedro, molding him into the young man who had risked everything for a stranger. Sitting beside his father, Pedro felt a deep sense of gratitude. His life had been far from easy, but it was filled with love, a love that gave him the strength to face each day with courage and hope. It was this love that had driven him to save Clara, and it was this love that now sustained him, guiding him toward a future he had once thought impossible. Outside of their home, Eduardo's influence continued to shape Pedro's life in ways that went beyond medical care. He made arrangements for Pedro to attend school, ensuring that he had access to the education he deserved. For Pedro, the prospect of returning to school was both thrilling and daunting. He hadn't stepped inside a classroom in years, and the idea of sitting among other students, of learning, of dreaming, felt almost surreal. On the first day of his new school, Clara met him at the entrance, her smile warm and encouraging. She had been a constant source of support, a friend who understood his fears and celebrated his courage. "You're going to be amazing, Pedro," she assured him, her eyes bright with excitement. "This is just the beginning. Imagine all the things you'll learn, all the places you'll go." Pedro smiled back, his heart pounding with a mix of nerves and anticipation. Stepping into the classroom, he felt the weight of countless eyes on him, the curiosity, the admiration, and even a hint of envy. But beyond these initial glances, Pedro soon found himself embraced by a community of students and teachers who admired him for more than his story. They saw his kindness, his humility, his unwavering dedication to his family, and they welcomed him as one of their own. As the weeks went by, Pedro settled into this new routine, finding joy in the small moments of learning and friendship that filled his days. He discovered a love for reading, for stories that transported him to worlds far beyond his own, and he excelled in mathematics, his quick mind finding comfort in the precision and logic of numbers. For the first time, he was free to explore his own potential, to dream of a future that wasn't bound by struggle or sacrifice. But even as he embraced this new chapter, Pedro never forgot where he had come from. Every evening, he returned to his father, to their modest home, to the quiet streets of his neighborhood. And with each return, he carried with him the lessons he had learned, the strength he had gained, and the love that had sustained him. He knew that his life was forever changed, not just by Eduardo's generosity, but by the resilience and kindness that had guided him through his darkest moments. For Pedro, these values were universal, timeless truths that transcended wealth and status. They were the threads that connected him to others, that bound him to a community, a family, a world larger than himself. And as he looked toward the future, he knew that he would carry these values with him, a quiet beacon of hope and compassion in a world that sometimes felt so divided. In every step he took, every lesson he learned, Pedro felt the presence of his father's teachings, the quiet strength of his community, the love of those who believed in him. His journey was far from over, but with each passing day, he grew stronger, more certain of the path before him. And in his heart, he knew that no matter where life led him, he would always remain true to the values that had shaped him, that had made him who he was. A boy whose kindness and courage had changed the lives of everyone he touched. As Pedro adjusted to his new life, he found himself grappling with questions he'd never considered before, questions about fairness, responsibility, and the true meaning of wealth. The more he observed the lives of those around him, especially the wealthy students at his school, the more he began to reflect on the difference between privilege and character, between having abundance and choosing to share it. One evening, Eduardo invited Pedro and his father to his home for dinner. Pedro, who was still adjusting to Eduardo's world of luxury, marveled at the beautiful house, its polished floors, and the warmth that filled each room. But as he looked around, he couldn't help but think of his own modest home, the peeling wallpaper, the chilly mornings, and the years of quiet struggle he and his father had endured together. In Eduardo's home, the comfort and security were tangible, a stark contrast to the uncertainty that had shadowed Pedro's life for so long. At dinner, Eduardo noticed Pedro's quietness and gently asked, "What's on your mind, Pedro? You seem deep in thought." Pedro hesitated, feeling a mixture of gratitude and confusion. "I was just thinking about how different our lives are," he said, glancing from Eduardo to his father. "I mean, you have so much here, things I never even imagined having. And yet, it feels like, I don't know, like something's missing." Eduardo leaned forward, intrigued. "Tell me, Pedro, what do you think is missing?" Pedro thought carefully, trying to put his feelings into words. "It's hard to explain," he began slowly. "But all my life, my father has taught me that what we have in our hearts matters more than what we have in our pockets. We may not have had much, but we had each other. And now, with everything you've done for us, I don't want to sound ungrateful, but I wonder, why don't more people with money do what you've done? Help those who really need it?" Eduardo was silent, his gaze fixed on Pedro, absorbing the young boy's sincerity and profound question. After a long pause, Eduardo nodded as though acknowledging something within himself. "That's a very wise observation, Pedro," he said. "You're right. Money can give people power, comfort, and security, but it doesn't guarantee happiness. And often people who have wealth can lose sight of the real meaning of life, distracted by things that don't truly matter." Eduardo's words were tinged with a quiet regret, a sense of realization that had only recently begun to dawn on him. "You see, Pedro, I worked very hard to build my life, to create security for my family, but somewhere along the way, I became so focused on success that I forgot about the people who were struggling. Meeting you reminded me of that. You showed me that there is more to life than just accumulating things." Pedro's father, Antonio, spoke up, his voice soft but full of gratitude. "Eduardo, you gave us more than we could have ever imagined. You taught my son that there are still people willing to help, people who see beyond themselves, and that is something worth more than any amount of money." Pedro looked between the two men, his heart swelling with a complex mix of admiration, respect, and confusion. He was beginning to see that Eduardo's kindness was not simply about wealth, it was about a choice, a deliberate decision to use what he had for the benefit of others. It made him question what responsibility came with having more than others. Was it a duty to share, to make a difference? Or was it simply an option, one that too many people chose to ignore? Eduardo seemed to sense Pedro's thoughts and continued, "Pedro, you've reminded me of something I had nearly forgotten, that the true purpose of wealth isn't just to make our own lives better, but to uplift those around us. It's a responsibility, one that I take seriously now. And it's something I hope to teach my daughter, Clara, so that she too grows up understanding that our lives are richer when we give to others." Clara, who had been quietly listening, looked at Pedro with a warm smile. "My dad's right, Pedro. Meeting you has changed the way I see things too. Sometimes it's easy to forget that not everyone has what we have, and that those who have less often give the most." As they finished dinner, Pedro felt a deep sense of purpose and resolve growing within him. He realized that his journey wasn't just about receiving help. It was about understanding the choices he could make with whatever he had, now and in the future. He thought of his father's teachings, the strength and kindness that had guided him through the toughest times. And he knew, with a clarity that surprised even him, that if he ever had the means, he would use it to make a difference, to reach out a hand to those who needed it most. The evening closed with a quiet sense of shared understanding between them all. They were from different worlds, yet they had found common ground in values that went beyond wealth or status. Pedro left Eduardo's house that night with a heart full of hope, knowing that he had not only gained a friend and a mentor, but had also learned the true meaning of generosity and responsibility. It was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life, a guiding light that would shape the person he would become. As Pedro and his father walked back to their modest home that night, the stars overhead cast a soft glow over the quiet streets. Pedro felt a warmth radiating through him, not from material gain, but from a deeper sense of belonging and purpose. His life had changed dramatically, but it was the values of kindness, resilience, and gratitude that had truly anchored his journey. He knew that while he had received an incredible gift, he had also played a part in bringing people together, inspiring a ripple of compassion through his actions. In the days that followed, Eduardo continued to support Pedro and Antonio in every way he could, guiding them not just with resources, but with friendship and wisdom. True to his word, he made sure Antonio received the medical care he needed, and Pedro flourished at school, finding joy in learning and a sense of wonder for the world of possibilities that had opened up to him. Pedro often visited Eduardo's home, not only to study with Clara, but to speak with Eduardo, who had become a mentor and a friend, someone he could rely on and look up to. Clara, too, became a dear friend, helping Pedro to adapt to his new school life with warmth and patience. Through their friendship, she learned to see the world through Pedro's eyes, gaining a compassion and understanding that went beyond words. One afternoon, as they sat together in Eduardo's garden, Pedro turned to Eduardo and Clara, his heart brimming with gratitude. "I don't think I'll ever find the right words to thank you," he began, his voice filled with sincerity. "You've done so much for me and my father, more than I could have ever imagined. You gave me hope when I had none left, and you taught me that kindness can truly change lives." Eduardo smiled, his gaze soft as he looked at the young man who had reminded him of life's true values. "Pedro, we're the ones who should be thanking you. Your courage, your selflessness, they reminded me of what really matters. You've given us all a gift by simply being who you are. And I'm grateful for the chance to know you, to help you, and to learn from you." Clara nodded, her eyes shining. "And I'm grateful to call you my friend, Pedro. You've taught me so much about strength and kindness. I feel lucky to know you." As they shared a moment of quiet reflection, Pedro felt the weight of their gratitude and realized that it was this connection, this exchange of kindness, that made life truly meaningful. He thought back to the morning he had saved Clara, how his only thought had been to help someone in need. And now, as he looked around at the people who had become like family to him, he knew that he had received so much more than he had ever given. That night, as he returned home to his father, Pedro felt a sense of peace, a feeling that his life was now woven into something larger, something that would carry him forward. He had been given a second chance, a new beginning, and he vowed to honor it with every fiber of his being. For Pedro, the future was no longer filled with fear and uncertainty, but with purpose, compassion, and gratitude. In his heart, he knew that he would always carry with him the lessons he had learned, the people who had believed in him, and the unwavering hope that kindness could indeed change the world. And as he looked up at the stars once more, he whispered a silent thank you to the universe, a promise that he would always strive to make a difference, just as others had done for him.